Okay, we're back on the record on State versus Loyd. He's present with his attorneys. State Attorney's Office is present. Everybody ready to go? We good on the jury? All right, let's bring the jury back in. State recognized presence of the jury? Defense? All right. Welcome back, folks. State, you may call your next witness.
State calls Richard Ruth.
Is this part of Williams' rule? Is this part of the Williams' rule? No? Okay.
Somewhat.
You may inquire.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jury and spell your last name?
My name is Richard Ruth, R-U-T-H.
Where do you work?
During my involvement with this case, I was employed with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in the Orlando Regional Operations Center Crime Laboratory.
And what did you do for Florida Department of Law Enforcement, also known as FDLE?
I was a crime laboratory analyst in the firearms section.
What did that involve?
My primary responsibilities were examining fired ammunition components to determine whether or not they were fired from a particular firearm. My administrative duties were case file review and handling evidence transfers.
How long did you work for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in that capacity?
Approximately 4 years as an analyst. Prior to that, 3 years as a forensic technologist.
Can you describe for the jury your educational background and training that allows you to do that?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree in astronomy and a Bachelor of Arts degree in physics from the University of Florida.
How did you get the training that enables you to do this job for Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
All of my training was provided by FDLE. The first part of my training program to become a forensic technologist was 6 months of full-time training. That taught me the different types of firearms and how to examine them and test fire them to determine their functionality. The second portion of my training is when I was promoted to crime laboratory analyst in the firearms section. That was an additional 12 months of full-time training, which was composed of practical as well as oral examinations, tests, and competency tests, where I was taught how to use a comparison microscope to compare fired ammunition components. I had to complete a period of supervised casework for both training programs, and for the crime laboratory analyst training portion, I also traveled to the Northeast and toured numerous firearms manufacturing facilities such as Smith & Wesson and Sig Sauer.
Can you estimate about how many examinations you've done in your career on firearms or firearm ammunition components?
I've examined thousands of firearms as well as hundreds to probably thousands of ammunition components.
What is involved in doing such an examination?
In examining a firearm, I note the make, model, the serial number, as well as the condition of the firearm, and I determine if it's safe to test fire within the laboratory to determine its functionality. Examining ammunition components involves the use of a comparison microscope to look at any microscopic imperfections that are imparted to those components from the firearm. These characteristics, they're called individual, and they arise from the manufacture of the firearm as well as the continued use and abuse. And when the ammunition component is fired in a gun, it can have the signature imprinted upon them.
So individual characteristics are individual to the firearm itself?
That's correct.
Are there other characteristics that belong to the class of firearms or the general brand?
Those are called class characteristics. That's features that are unique to a specific make and model of firearm, such as the caliber of the ammunition, the diameter of the bullet, and even the safety features that are on the firearm. The best analogy I can provide for class characteristics is something we're familiar with every day, and that's makes and models of vehicles. Sedans normally have 4 doors. A coupe would have 2 doors. Those are class characteristics. That should be the same for each make and model of a car that you would drive.
If a firearm is made by the same manufacturer using the same process, how could the firearm have different individual characteristics?
It's due to all the variables involved during manufacturing that are outside the manufacturer's control. The tools that are used to manufacture a firearm are under a constant state of wear. There's a lot of vibration and temperature variation involved, and even the metals that compose a firearm are not homogeneous in nature. There are also imperfections in the metal that are used itself. So in studying firearms that have been manufactured consecutively, one right after the other, there's still enough difference between the firearms and those individual characteristics to be able to distinguish the ammunition components from each other and to an individual firearm.
For those jurors who are not familiar with firearms, can you explain generally how a firearm works? And we're talking about a semi-automatic.
In a semi-automatic, they generally use a magazine in which cartridges are loaded into the magazine. The slide on a semi-automatic would be pulled to the rear, and when you release it, it would chamber a cartridge. It would be ready to fire at this point. Pulling the trigger would strike the cartridge with the firing pin, and that would fire the cartridge, expelling a projectile by the means of an explosive.
And once that projectile is expelled in a semi-automatic, what happens to load another round?
During that firing process, there's a lot of pressure built up during that action. The gas doesn't only just push the projectile down the barrel and expel it, it also acts in a rearward force on the firearm. It drives the slide to the rear, extracting and ejecting the cartridge case, throwing it clear of the firearm, and as the slide returns forward under spring tension, it would chamber another cartridge and it would be ready to fire again. In a semi-automatic, to fire the next cartridge, it would require a separate pull of the trigger.
So even though it's called an automatic, it's semi-automatic, because you got to pull the trigger each time you want to fire a bullet.
That's correct. The extraction and ejection is automatic. It automatically loads the next cartridge, but what it means by semi-automatic, you have to pull the trigger each time to fire the gun.
What is meant by the term caliber, like a 9mm versus a 40 caliber?
Caliber, most simply, it's the size of ammunition that a firearm is designed to fire. More specifically for a bullet, it's the diameter of the bullet.
Have you ever testified and given opinion testimony in the area of firearm or firearm analysis and comparison, or component analysis and comparison?
I have approximately 25 times.
Were you provided some evidence in this case, the state of Florida versus Markeith Loyd?
I was.
All right. Showing you State's Exhibit 5, a 9mm firearm collected from the yard of house at Law&Crime Drive. I'm also showing you State's Exhibit 6, 7, and 8. The magazine, the ammunition from the magazine, and the live round from that firearm. Did you receive those items for analysis?
I did.
Did you examine those items?
Yes.
Did you ever receive any casings or projectiles from that Law&Crime Drive scene that could have been fired from that firearm?
No, the caliber would have been incorrect.
The firearm that I just provided you, how do you insert the magazine into that firearm?
Once the magazine is loaded with cartridges, the magazine is inserted into what's called the magazine well of the pistol. It's the underside. You would push it up until it locks into place.
And how would you eject the magazine out of that firearm?
On this particular firearm, there's what's called a magazine release. It's a button on the side of the frame of the pistol that you can actuate with your thumb. You would press this button to unlock it, and then the magazine could be pulled out of the magazine well of the pistol.
How many rounds did that magazine hold if it was loaded full to capacity?
15.
How many rounds did you receive that came out of that firearm?
14 were said to have been removed from the magazine. One was said to have been recovered from the magazine well of the pistol.
And if the magazine was not fully inserted into the firearm, will a round be able to be chambered into the firearm?
In my opinion, no, likely not. It might have a problem feeding a cartridge into the chamber of the barrel. It really needs to be in the upwardmost position and locked in place to reliably load a cartridge.
And so how do you lock a magazine in place into the firearm?
You would have to push it upwards until it clicks in place and engages that magazine release button that would hold it in place.
Did you also receive a .40 caliber firearm in connection with this case?
I did.
Showing you Stacy did a 24 for identification. You recognize that?
I do.
And what else is contained in that item besides the firearm?
It's a magazine as well as some cartridges. The exact number I can't remember.
Right. Did the magazine and the cartridges provided in that box fit that firearm?
They did. They're all 40 Smith & Wesson caliber cartridges, and the magazine is compatible with this firearm.
And is that also a semi-automatic?
It is.
You mentioned earlier in your explanation that when the trigger is pulled of a semi-automatic firearm, and obviously shoots the bullet out the barrel, and the rearward force causes the casing to expel out of the gun, right?
Yes.
Okay. How does that happen?
This happens through the 7 steps of operation. Cartridge, it's a single unit of ammunition composed of cartridge case, a primer, gunpowder, and the projectile, which is actually the bullet. Sometimes people think of bullets as a cartridge. Cartridge is actually everything that's contained, where for me the bullet is simply just the projectile there. So by inserting the magazine into the pistol, pulling the slide rearward, and chambering a cartridge, pulling the trigger fires the cartridge. The primer is struck by the firing pin of the firearm. That causes a flame to ignite the gunpowder, which turns the gunpowder into a rapidly expanding gas. That force pushes the bullet out of the barrel and expels it from the firearm. And that same pressure generated is what drives the slide to the rear, extracting and ejecting just the cartridge case now, because the bullet has now left the firearm. And as it returns forward, it's going to chamber the next cartridge in the magazine, ready to be fired again in the same manner.
In which direction does the casing eject from the firearm in that .40 caliber firearm?
Generally, it's outward and to the right.
Is that the ejection ports on the right of the firearm itself?
That's correct.
And you said generally.
Yes.
Why would it be generally, not always?
There's a lot of variables involved with the ejection pattern of a firearm. It's actually not an examination that FDLE provides because of these variables. There's a lot of things involved, such as the angle that the firearm is held. Is it being held vertically? Is it being held sideways? If the gun is fired, the cartridge case, it's in contact with just a single hook that has some play in it, and it's striking a post to hit it out of the firearm. Another thing that could also come into play is there a cartridge in the magazine? The cartridge case is going to contact that cartridge and be ejected, versus if the magazine were empty for that last shot, that cartridge case wouldn't have a cartridge to come in contact to. So that's why I use the term generally. There's a lot of variables involved that determine where that cartridge case is coming out of the firearm.
When the cartridge casing is ejected from the firearm, does it just fall out, or does it actually expel and go a distance?
It can go a distance, and it depends on the surface it's coming into contact to. Is it falling into grass and staying put? Is it bouncing off of concrete? Is it hitting a carpeted surface? That's really going to affect where the cartridge case remains after the gun is fired.
So if I'm standing in one position firing the same gun multiple times, are the casings going to always land in the same place?
They'll land in approximately the same general area. You might be able to extrapolate from that pattern of cartridge cases. However, that starts going outside of my realm of expertise.
What did you do to test or examine that firearm?
I noted the make, model, the caliber, as well as the serial number of the firearm. I noted its condition. It was in fair condition. And I determined that it was safe to test fire. So I test fired it in our indoor firing range using laboratory cartridges and determined that it was a functional firearm.
Why do you test fire?
Simply to ensure that I can say without a doubt that it expels a projectile by the means of an action of an explosive. There's also another thing that I have to do. If the firearm is going to be compared to any evidence, such as cartridge cases or projectiles, I need to obtain standards from the firearm. By test firing those laboratory cartridges, I have projectiles that are recovered from an indoor firing range, indoor water tank that I know came from that firearm. I also have the cartridge cases. These cartridge cases and projectiles that I fired and generated during my examination can be compared to evidence to determine if the evidence was fired in this firearm.
When you're examining that firearm and test firing it, do you also measure what's called trigger pull?
I do.
What is that?
Trigger pull is the amount of weight required to pull the trigger. The way I conduct this examination, you hold the firearm upright, and then you add weights to the trigger. You lift the firearm, and with these weights, you determine at which point the firing pin is released on the firearm. In this particular firearm, the amount of force required was approximately 9 3/4 to 10 pounds to release the firing pin in this pistol.
Okay. So in order to pull the trigger, 9 3/4 to 10 pounds of pressure had to be applied?
That's correct.
Okay. Is that normal for that type of a firearm?
Yes, for this make and model, that's consistent with the other weights that I've measured.
Was there anything out of the ordinary about how that firearm functioned?
No.
And what is the capacity of that firearm and magazine that was provided to you?
The magazine can hold 14 cartridges. An additional cartridge could be in the chamber of the barrel, so you could hold at most 15 in this firearm.
Were you also asked to scientifically examine that firearm to determine if it fired various projectiles or casings in this case?
I was.
Okay. And specifically, did those items come from two different scenes?
Yes,
One was a Walmart scene, one was a scene at Long Peak Drive?
that's correct.
Sustained. Leave credit. What was the question? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Overruled. Go ahead.
And how do you make that comparison? Again, you briefly touched on it earlier.
By having the standards that I generate from a firearm, it can be compared using a comparison microscope. It's essentially two separate microscopes that are joined with an optical bridge. I can put my standard on one microscope and the evidence on another, and I can visually compare these microscopic imperfections present on ammunition components to see if there's any similarities in these individual characteristics.
Approach.
You may.
I'm showing you States Exhibit 12, which are 11 fired .40 caliber casings from the Long Peak Drive scene. Did you examine those items?
I did.
And did you use the same procedure that you just described using the microscope?
At first, there was no suspect firearm submitted for examination, so these were compared in the absence of the standard. I determined that they were fired from the same unknown firearm at that point, and then I was able to compare it to standards later when a firearm was submitted for comparison.
And when the firearm that we're looking at, the .40 caliber?
Yes.
Okay. When you compared the casings to the test fires from that .40 caliber firearm, what did you determine?
I determined that these cartridge cases were fired from this firearm.
Next question again.
Yes, sir.
showing you State's Exhibit 9, which is a projectile fragment from marker 10 at the Long Peak Drive residence. Did you examine that?
I did.
Fragment.
I did.
Okay. When you examined that projectile fragment and compared it to that .40 caliber firearm, what did you conclude?
With this particular one, I believe this was the lead fragment, correct? Lead fragment. There was no comparison able to be done with this, as I determined it was just a fragment of lead. There were no individual characteristics on which to base an examination. Therefore, I determined that it was of no value for microscopic comparison purposes.
There just wasn't enough markings on it for you to do anything with?
That's correct.
Showing you State's Exhibit 10 in evidence, which is a projectile fragment from marker 12 at the Long Peak Drive scene. Did you examine that item?
I did.
Did you compare that item to determine if it was fired from that .40 caliber firearm?
Similarly to the previous exhibit, this was a portion of a bullet core. A bullet has some construction to it as well, the projectile. The inside of the bullet consists of a lead core, and it can be wrapped in what's called a jacket. It's usually copper. This is a portion of the inside of the bullet that doesn't come into contact with the firearm. There are no individual characteristics present on this bullet core. Therefore, I couldn't determine what firearm it may have came from. It was of no value for microscopic comparison purposes.
That's because the firearm didn't leave any individual characteristics on the center of the projectile?
Yes.
Showing you State's Exhibit 11, a projectile fragment from marker 14 at the Long Peak Drive scene. Did you examine that item?
I did.
When you compare that item to this .40 caliber firearm, specifically State's AC for identification, what did you find?
I determined that this exhibit was fired from this pistol using a microscopic comparison.
Showing you State's Exhibit 13, a projectile that was removed from marker SM1, strike mark 1 from the Long Peak Drive scene. Did you analyze that item?
I did.
Did you compare it to the .40 caliber firearm in front of you?
I did. I also determined that this item was fired from this pistol.
Okay. You got one moment, Ron?
Yes, sir.
Showing you up in Markeith State's Exhibit S, as in Sam, which is a projectile recovered from Sade Dixon's arm. You analyzed that item to determine whether or not it was fired from that .40 caliber firearm.
I did.
What did you conclude?
I also concluded that this item was fired from this pistol.
You mentioned that you received evidence from two different scenes. Did you receive evidence from a scene at Walmart in Orange County, Florida?
I did.
Showing you what's in Markeith State's Exhibit 17, 8 spent .40 caliber casings located at that scene. Did you analyze those casings?
I did.
Did you compare those casings to determine whether it was fired from that .40 caliber firearm?
I did.
What did you determine?
Overruled? You may answer.
I determined that these cartridge cases were fired from this pistol.
Showing you State's Exhibit 18, a piece of lead located at Come and Pee at the Walmart parking lot. Did you analyze that item?
I did.
Did you compare that to determine whether it was fired from that .40 caliber firearm?
May I refer to my notes on my conclusion on these?
Memory.
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay. Did you compare that item to see if it was fired from that .40 caliber firearm?
I couldn't. I determined that this was an apparent bullet core portion. It was a piece of lead that appears to have been from the inside of a projectile. It doesn't have any individual characteristics on it, therefore it was no value for microscopic comparison purposes.
Showing you State's Exhibit 19, a projectile located at cone Q at the Walmart parking lot. Do you analyze that?
I did.
Compared that to determine whether it was fired from that .40 caliber firearm.
Yes.
What did you determine?
I determined that this item was fired from this pistol.
Showing you State's Exhibit 20, a copper jacket located at cone S in the Walmart parking lot as well. Did you analyze that item and compare it to determine whether it could be fired from that .40 caliber firearm?
Yes.
What did you determine?
I determined that this was fired from this pistol.
Showing you State's 21, a copper jacket located in the passenger floor of a vehicle in the Walmart parking lot. To examine that item to determine if it was fired from that .40 caliber firearm.
I did. I would have to refer to my notes one more time to determine what my conclusion was. Okay. I determined that this too was fired from this pistol.
So both casing and projectiles found that both scenes were fired from that .40 caliber firearm.
In my opinion, yes.
Referring to evidence from the Walmart scene, did you receive a projectile collected by a detective, Shane Overfield, Exhibit Q13?
Yes.
Did you analyze that projectile to determine if it was fired by that .40 caliber firearm?
I did. I concluded that Q13 was not fired from that pistol.
Did you also receive a 9mm firearm represented to be from Sergeant Everglade?
Yes.
Did you compare the projectile Q13 collected by Detective Cloverfield from the parking lot of Walmart with the 9mm handgun represented to be from Sergeant Clayton?
I did.
And what did you determine?
Unfortunately, with Q13, it was too damaged to reach a definitive conclusion. I came to what's called a neither nor inconclusive statement. There wasn't enough agreement or disagreement of individual characteristics to determine whether or not that was fired from that 9mm pistol.
So you don't know.
Correct.
Okay. No further questions at this time. Thank you, sir.
Cross? Sure.
How are you, sir?
Doing well, thank you.
So I want to talk about that, the 9mm that was taken from the shooting scene, not the Walmart scene, the other scene. You mentioned that there was a bullet that was out of the magazine that they had mentioned that wasn't in the actual magazine. So there was 14 in the magazine and then one that was loose. What is the explanation for that, for them finding one in the well, I guess they would call it?
That's what I heard it was described. I can only speculate why one could have been loose in the magazine well of the pistol.
All right, so what would your speculation be?
There's several possibilities. A cartridge could have been inserted in the magazine well and then a loaded magazine behind it. If the magazine wasn't inserted fully in the pistol and the slide were drawn to the rear and came forward, if it had jammed, it could have dislodged the cartridge from the magazine but remained in the pistol. If the firearm was dropped. It could have jostled the cartridge loose from the magazine, leaving the other 14 in there, but one loose inside of the firearm.
Thank you, sir. Now, going back to the Q13 that was examined, you eliminated that from the 40. There's no question about that, correct?
Correct.
Okay. But you, because of the damage, you couldn't neither identify nor eliminate that from being fired from the Q4 pistol, which is Sergeant Clayton's 6-hour pistol, correct?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Redirect. All right, may this witness be excused? All right, thank you, sir. You are free to go.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, those are all of the witnesses we have for today. As I said, we've gotten ahead of ourselves, which is not a bad thing. So we're going to end early today. Your lunch is here. So deputy's going to provide you with some lunch. You'll return to the hotel this afternoon, and you guys have a great weekend. I will see you Monday morning at 9 a.m. Thank you very much. Court's in recess. Anything we need to address before we recess for the weekend? No? 9 o'clock's fine on Monday, unless there's some pending issue I'm not aware of. Did you all file any motions that I didn't see? No? There's no pending motions or anything, right? Have you all talked about the proposed jury instructions at all?
I've provided them, but I've not discussed them with the defense.
Okay. All right. All righty, have a good weekend. Court's in recess.